Thanks so much, and thanks for coming today. I really appreciate it. And I want to talk to you just for a couple of minutes on why this project is important. I think that most people in this room, because you've looked into World War I a little bit, know that we live under the long shadow of the First World War in so many ways. It was a war that saw the fall of empires. It was a war that redefined the maps of Europe and the world, particularly the Middle East. And today we live under the social and economic and geopolitical terms that were set by the 14 points and the armistice at Versailles. And that's so important to us on a day-to-day basis. But I think that there's another aspect to this that's really forgotten a lot of times, and that's the people that served in the war. The mothers and fathers, the sons and daughters that went off to fight America's first big overseas crusade. You know, we dabbled in taking armies and navies across the world before, but this was the first time that we took a large, as close as you could get to a universal draft force of some, ultimately was planned to be 4 million people, but 2 million people get overseas to fight on foreign soil, including France and Italy and Russia. A lot of people forget that part of the Great Adventure, as it was called. And it was done to make the world safe for democracy. And you know, through a lens of the 21st century, we look at that and we see it as idealism at its most naive form. But that wasn't the case in 1917 and 1918 when we went over there. And when the parades ended, and when the memorials were erected, and when the people got on with their lives, this became a forgotten war that was eclipsed so much so by America's more frequent dabbles, including World War II, that was just many, many times more commitment by the United States. But it was a war that brought on an American century. And it was a war that changed the world for America. There was no going back. There was no more discussion of no entangling alliances. And so I think that it is so important for so many reasons that we honor these people, that we serve as the voice of a World War I generation and awaken that in a new generation of Americans. So many of the targets, if you will, of the World War I Centennial Commission is the commemoration of this war through education, remembrance, and through commemoration of particular sites. Everyone is aware that Congress authorized 2 memorials, one in Kansas City, the Liberty Memorial out there in Kansas City, and one on the National Mall. And as part of that, we want to redevelop the National Mall site, currently Pershing Park, into a fitting memorial to these people so that their tombstones are not their only memorials. So I'm proud to be here, and I represent my fellow commissioners. Libby O'Connell is in the room, one of our commissioners, and Edwin Fountain, I'm about to introduce, my vice chair. This is some work that we think is significant and important. A place that will better Pennsylvania Avenue, a place that will serve as a reminder to Americans the struggles and the conflicts that these people went through for us. We are their legacy. So without further ado, I'll introduce the man that's the project lead and someone you'll see in a minute who feels very strongly about this project, as we all do, Edwin Fountain. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Rob. And again, my name is Edwin Fountain. I'm the vice chair of the World War I Centennial Commission. I've been involved in the discussion about the need for a National World War I Memorial in Washington for some 7 years now. And I'm very excited that today we are launching the international design competition for a new national memorial here in Washington. A little background on the commission itself. We are a federal agency. We were chartered by Congress in 2013. Our members are appointed by the President, by the majority and minority leaders of both houses of Congress, the VFW and the American Legion, and by the National World War I Museum in Kansas City. We are that rare federal agency in that we have a shelf life. By statute, we will expire in July 2019, unless we are still working on the memorial in which case we will survive until we complete the memorial project. Congress gave us 5 specific tasks. The first is to plan and execute our own commemorative programs and projects, and the memorial is certainly one of the key projects we have taken on our own account. The next 3 are to encourage, facilitate, promote activities by public and private organizations throughout the country. One thing we often say about the commemoration of World War I in the United States is that it's typically American in 2 respects. One, the U.S. is late to the party, just as we were to World War I itself. Second, that much of the best work in the commemoration will be done from the ground up. And one of the gratifying things that we've come across is the number of individuals and organizations around the country that on their own initiative, on their own dime, are undertaking commemorative activities without any demand on the commission itself. And then the fifth task is to make recommendations to Congress and the President. And one of the first recommendations we made to the Congress was that it pass legislation authorizing the commission to establish a National World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. And it did so as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2015, passed last December. And we got immediately to work. For the last few months, we have engaged with the various other federal agencies that are stakeholders in memorials in Washington that will review and approve any designs we ultimately submit. We engaged a team of highly respected and experienced competition advisors. One of them is in the room with us, Roger Lewis, who many of you may know is not only is he a notable architect, but he's a fellow journalist, as he writes the column in the Washington Post on land use and architecture that you may well be familiar with. So you're all familiar with the 3 National War Memorials that are actually on the mall. Top left, of course, is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That was the first of them, erected in 1982. Followed thereafter, some years later, by the Korean War Veterans Memorial, and then after that by the World War II Memorial, the most recent of the 3. Those are the later 3 of the 4 great wars of the 20th century. And as Rob said, what has come to be known as the American century. And when I got started in this process some years ago, it began with my sense of symmetry being offended, that we had these national memorials to the other 3 wars, but not to the one that started the 20th century, not to the war that directly or indirectly led to each of these later conflicts. And these conflicts cannot be understood without an understanding of World War I. And so that began a discussion of should there be, do we need a National World War I Memorial? And a lot of people, as I've gone through this process, it's occurred to me that for a lot of people they think, well, World War I was just sort of some minor episode in American history, not of much more significance than the Spanish-American War or the Philippine insurrection. And what people don't realize, and I think this is the single most important fact as to why a memorial is necessary, if you look at that first red number at the bottom, the United States lost more American servicemen in World War I than in Vietnam and Korea combined. And what's even more staggering about that figure is that in Vietnam we lost 58,000 combat deaths or overall deaths in about 8 years of the main period of active fighting. Korea, 54,000 in 3 years. That 116,000 in World War I is concentrated in 6 months of serious fighting. The combat fatality rate in World War I was at least 50% greater than that of World War II. It was a savage, bloody war that American forces made a major commitment to, and that fact is just not understood in America today. I think one of the reasons that, and the challenge for our commission and the importance of our work derives from the fact that World War I simply does not exist in the American consciousness. It does not resonate in the American consciousness the way that the later wars do. World War II is represented in this tremendous wealth of newsreel footage, of contemporary reporting, output from Hollywood, novels, television shows, culminating most recently in the Band of Brothers series and Saving Private Ryan, that really bring home to the American people today, what those wars were about. Civil War, we obviously have an intense emotional connection to. We can visit those battle sites here in the United States. Again, a tremendous representation in popular culture. Even Korea, which some people say is a forgotten war. And maybe I'm speaking to the wrong generation here in this room because we all watched MASH. But that at least brought Korea into our living rooms in a way that World War I was never brought into our living rooms, and certainly not today. So I thought, as part of this presentation, it'd be useful to show a few pictures and tell a couple stories. Up in the upper left picture, those are 3 soldiers of the 3rd Division. In 1918, when the Germans knew that 2 million American troops were on their way to Europe to reinforce the British and French, they launched a major offensive to bring the war to the end before the United States could fully deploy. And U.S. troops were thrown into the line along the length of the Marne River, which is about 50 miles northeast of Paris. And the Germans crossed the river essentially everywhere except where Americans weren't. And the 3rd Division, at a place called Chateau-Thierry, held the bridges over the Marne River, and won for themselves the nickname that they carry to this day, the Rock of the Marne. Later that year came the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Once America and its allies had stopped the German offensive, they launched an offensive along the length of the Western Front against the Germans to start driving the Germans out of France and Belgium. And American forces were concentrated in the sector along the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. And it's the largest battle in American military history. We committed 1.2 million troops. In 6 weeks, we lost 26,000 dead in that campaign. And the middle photograph is of Major Charles Whittlesey, who was the commander of a unit that's come to be known as the Lost Battalion. And this was an episode in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Major Whittlesey was in command of about 500 men who advanced beyond the flanking units on either side of them and found themselves cut off and surrounded by German forces. And for 6 days, they made a celebrated stand, repulsing bayonet charges and hand-to-hand attacks from the Germans, withstanding artillery bombardment from the Germans, withstanding artillery bombardment from American forces, who were trying to defend them but were shelling their own positions. And in the Smithsonian is a pigeon today, the stuffed carrier pigeon known as Cher Ami, dear friend. And that was the pigeon that Major Whittlesey sent back to the rear lines with the message, for heaven's sake, stop shelling us. 500 men, Rob can correct me on the numbers, but about 200 died, 150 were missing, and 150 walked out when they were relieved 6 days later. Major Whittlesey was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, and he was later one of the pallbearers of the unknown soldier that came home after the war. He had been a Wall Street lawyer prior to the war, and this is one of those things that gives World War I contemporary relevance, because, looking at the picture there of the aid treatment, great advances in military medicine came out of World War I, and we heard back then terms such as shell shock and whatnot that we now identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. But Whittlesey, who had been a civilian before the war, he was a true citizen soldier. In 1921, he was on a cruise ship in the Caribbean between the United States and Cuba. And one evening, after having dinner with his companions, he excused himself and walked out onto the deck and stepped off the back of the ship. And so that sort of, those sorts of individual stories we don't carry with us. We have the visions of Normandy. We don't have the visions of World War I, and those are important visions to have. So when you ask, why do we need a World War I memorial, I say, look at these faces. These are the same faces you see in the Band of Brothers that represent every cross-section of American society, who either volunteered to serve their country or, if drafted, did their duty to their country. And the soldiers in World War I showed the same courage and valor and sacrifice as those in the later wars that we do commemorate on the National Mall. They got up out of trenches. They ran across open fields in machine gun fire. They charged into forests that were infested with machine gun nests. They charged up hills that the Germans had spent years fortifying. With the same heroism, the same sacrifice, the same bravery that we commemorate in later wars. And they died in greater numbers than in every war in our history except for the Civil War and World War II. So to me, that says it all. To recognize that service and sacrifice, they deserve to be honored with the same respect and devotion that we accord to the veterans of later wars. And that's one of the missions of our Centennial Commission. So then the question becomes how to honor them and where to honor them. This is the Liberty Memorial in Kansas City. After the war, before the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, we didn't think in terms in this country of national war memorials, at least not in Washington. And towns all around the country after the Civil War erected memorials to their local citizens who fought and died in that war. And similarly, after World War I, civic groups, towns and counties and states, groups of all sorts erected thousands of World War I memorials around the country, but they were almost exclusively memorials to citizens of a particular locality or of a particular corporation. The Library of Congress has a plaque in its walls with the 4 employees of the Library of Congress who were killed in the war. But the good citizens of Kansas City, to their credit, erected a memorial that they conceived as a memorial to all the nation's veterans of the war, not just those from Kansas City. And it is now the home of the National World War I Museum. And it's a fine memorial. With all due respect, it's in Kansas City. It is not the nation's capital. Kansas City does not get the visitation, both from U.S. citizens and from international visitors, that the United States gets. And more importantly, we do now have those 3 other memorials to Vietnam, Korea, and World War II on the mall. And so to say that the National Memorial is in Kansas City sends a message that somehow we don't value, we don't honor the service and sacrifice of our World War I veterans to the same extent as we do those of later wars. There are other World War I memorials in Washington. On the left is that's literally the big red one, the 1st Division Memorial in front of the old Executive Office Building. On the right is the 2nd Division Memorial located on Constitution Avenue. And then, of course, there is, in fact, a D.C. World War I memorial on the mall. This is the District of Columbia War Memorial on Independence Avenue. It was dedicated in 1931 and stood alone for 50 years until the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was installed in 1982 on the other side of the Lincoln Reflecting Pool. It now sits between the World War II and Korean memorials south of the Reflecting Pool. So when the conversation about a National World War I memorial began some years ago, it was recognized that a federal statute called the Commemorative Works Act prohibits any new memorials, monuments, museums on the mall, because the statute decrees that the mall is a, quote, completed work of civic art. So there was the proposal to take advantage of the fact that there was already an existing World War I memorial in the mall, and so rather than having to build a new memorial, to expand that memorial and give it a national content as well as a local content. There was also separate legislation to create an exemption to the Commemorative Works Act and authorize a standalone memorial on the mall. But for lots of reasons that are no longer pertinent, that legislation failed. And when the commission was formed, the Centennial Commission was formed, we determined that not to refight those fights. We thought that it would be a futile exercise to try to get a site on the mall, and so we looked for the next best site in the nation's capital. And we chose Pershing Park. Obviously, there is a World War I connection there. General Pershing, John J. Blackjack Pershing, was of course the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, the U.S. troops in theater in Europe during World War I. And so we asked Congress for authorization to expand this memorial and make it a memorial site fitting of the name National World War I Memorial. And if you don't know its location, it is on Pennsylvania Avenue. One attractive feature of the site is that it, other than the mall, Pennsylvania Avenue is probably the most symbolically important piece of real estate in the country. And Pershing Park, which is located right in front of the Willard Hotel, 1 block from the White House, has pride of place at the western end of the Great Diagonal connecting the U.S. Capitol with the White House. And so symbolically, it's an extremely important property. There is lots of foot traffic there from people coming and going to the mall, going to the White House. It's a key aspect of the ongoing Pennsylvania Avenue redevelopment, and we're proud to be there. This is a little bit of a close-up on the site. Again, to the north, you can see the Willard Hotel. To the south is the Department of Commerce building. Outside the picture to the east is Freedom Plaza, and then the Treasury Department, the White House, and a statue of General Sherman across 15th Street to the west. Now, the red box in this picture outlines exactly where the Pershing commemorative element is. It's off in the southeast corner of the park. And that slab in the middle, let me bring up a different picture. As originally designed, the central feature of this park was a area that would be an ornamental pool in the summertime and an ice skating rink in the winter. And for some years it was used for that purpose, but then the park began experiencing mechanical and plumbing issues, sewage backup, stormwater backup, and whatnot. And so for several years now, the site has not been used for its intended purpose. You can sort of see along the three sides of the park, those grassy areas, those are actually about 10-foot high berms. You can look at the scale of the berms relative to the cars parked in front. And that enables the site to be at a level grade, and it also allows for an amphitheater depression in the middle of the park. And those high walls provide, when you're in the park, they do provide a nice sense of containment and enclosure, and it acoustically and visually shields the traffic and street noise from the surrounding streets. The disadvantage of those features is that as you're walking along the park, you really have no idea what's there. And there's nothing that entices the passerby in or says, here's a memorial that you should come look at. Along the north side is the back end parking for the Willard and other buildings along that block. And then the park also has this not quite abandoned but no longer used gazebo that was the concession stand for the ice skating rink. You could get snacks there, drinks, rent your ice skates, whatnot, but no longer being used for that purpose. And this is the Pershing Memorial element. You see that there's a statue of General Pershing. There's a wall behind him. Sorry about that. There we go. Yeah, the wall behind him just announces who he is. On the back side of that wall is a quotation from him extolling the troops under his command. And then perpendicular to that is another wall that has some very good text. It's a good history lesson of the American engagement in World War I, and it has two good maps, one of the Western Front and one of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. My one criticism of that text is that while it talks about the accomplishments of U.S. forces in the war, it doesn't go down further to the level of the common soldier. It doesn't talk about the fact that we lost 116,000, that we had 200,000 more wounded. The site is a good history lesson. It's a good memorial to General Pershing, although, as I say, he's not even riding a horse. But compared to the later memorials, we feel that it lacks a lot of the emotional power, a lot of the inspiration, a lot of the opportunity for grief and reflection that memorials like the Vietnam or Korean War memorials do have. And so what we're hoping to do is enhance that memorial, add additional commemorative elements that will thematically bring those aspects into the memorial site. Our view is that currently, going back again to the overhead, right now it's a park that has a memorial element kind of tacked onto it almost as an afterthought. And we'd like to make it a site that is looked at first and foremost as a World War I memorial, but a memorial that is located in a living, breathing urban park. I mean, this is not a standalone memorial like the ones on the mall where you go visit, pay your respects, and then leave. This is a park surrounded by hotels, office buildings, restaurants, many other urban uses, and so it needs to serve those urban uses, but at the same time, it does need to honor the heroism of American forces and commemorate the tragedy and magnitude of their sacrifice. We obviously want a memorial that will be relevant 100 years from now, and not just today. And there's the very difficult challenge in this site of balancing that sense of dignity and enclosure, yet having it be open and visible to passersby. And then one other challenge is that there are important elements in the site that need to be incorporated into any new design, and it needs to fit within the overall context of Pennsylvania Avenue, the many varied types of adjacent properties, and then the overall character of Pennsylvania Avenue. So it's a difficult challenge, and that's why the commission didn't take on its own account the design of the memorial, because we're absolutely unqualified to do that. And that's why we've opened it up to a design competition, much as was done, for instance, with the Vietnam Memorial. And you know, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Competition captured lightning in a bottle to come up with that design that came out of nowhere and was from an architect who came out of nowhere. And we can only hope to approximate that. We debated whether this should be closed to U.S. participants or whether it should be an international competition. And we decided it should be an international competition. It does obviously commemorate a major event in world history. And so we thought it important for the competition to have that character. And at the same time, there is to this day tremendous gratitude in Europe for the role the United States played in the war, and we wanted to give European designers the opportunity to express their gratitude to the United States for our service in the war. It's an open all-comers competition. There's no professional requirement for any entrance in the first stage of the competition. We do require at Stage 2 that any Stage 2 finalists will partner with a U.S. licensed professional architecture or landscape architecture firm, primarily for two reasons. One, this is a complex project that frankly is beyond the abilities of an amateur. And second, because particularly in Washington, but the regulatory process of getting a memorial design approved requires familiarity with the environmental and historic preservation and design considerations that go into a project like this. We are, as long as we can, pursuing a very ambitious schedule. I've been counting how many times somebody tells me this schedule is, quote, insane, and I'm up to 2 so far. The key date is the last one, November 11, 2018. That is, of course, Veterans Day. And I'd be curious how many people in this country know that Veterans Day was originally Armistice Day, the anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. And in 2018, that will be the 100th anniversary of the armistice. So we are targeting that date, not primarily for its symbolic importance, but also because we're realistic and we understand that the fundraising for this project will be a challenge. This will be supported entirely by private funds. We are barred from any congressional appropriation for the memorial. And we're under no illusions that fundraising for a World War I memorial will be more of a lift than fundraising for a World War II or a Vietnam War memorial. And the Centennial period gives us the best opportunity to do that fundraising. And so it's important to complete the process within the Centennial. So working backwards, we hope to break ground Veterans Day 2017. That means by the beginning of 2017, we really need to complete the regulatory review process, which means we need a design by the beginning of 2016. So the competition is now open. We turned the website on late last night, and at 2 o'clock when we sat down here, we officially opened the competition. Stage 1 submissions are due July 21st. And we hope to announce our Stage 2 finalists. There will be 3 to 5 finalists. We hope to announce them in this August, and then work with those designs, refine those designs throughout the fall, and then submit them for review by the jury and selection by the commission in 2016. Roger Lewis and Don Stastny, our competition advisors, have helped us put together a jury that is diverse across a number of different fronts. It includes a number of highly respected urban designers and landscape designers. It includes a retired Army general who is currently the director of Joint History for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It includes someone I expect many of you are familiar with, Ben Forgey, a longtime architecture critic for the Washington Post. It includes a professor from St. Francis College in New York who literally wrote the book on World War I statuary and sculpture and memorials in the United States. And so it's a jury that brings together a lot of very different perspectives, and we're very excited to see what designs will come out of this competition.